Ladies and gentlemen, it is very nice to see so many of you here today. As I'm sure most of you know, if not all, IVA has a 100th anniversary this year, and we have actually been celebrating this special year by delivering a number of different kinds of events which are very much based on IVA's statutes, on IVA's purpose on the world, which is pretty much to kind of try to explain and spread scientific information to not least to the political decision makers and policy makers, but also to the general audience, and also sharing insights about important environmental and societal issues between ourselves. And so today, during this year, all of our departments, all of the 12, have been preparing these annual jubileum activities and seminars. And today it is the Department of Biotechnology, where Stefan Ståhl is the chair that is organizing today's event. And so I give the word to Stefan then.
Thank you, Tula. As the chairman, it is a true pleasure to see you all here, and I wish you all most welcome to this event then. And I'm very, very delighted to be able to present Eugen Steiner as the chair for this session, for this event. Eugen fits very well as the chairman for this event. He has a background as a medical doctor and a PhD in clinical pharmacology from Karolinska. He has also been the CEO of a private lab that was one of the first acting in the field of surveillance medicine. And also you have some 23 years in venture capital in the life science field, which is also relevant. And as a person, I see you as a very curious, interested in most of things, and especially if there is some new findings in the field of life science that could bring some light on a better well-being. So you're extremely well suited for this. So, but I shouldn't forget the most important thing. He's also the cover boy of this month in Nordic Life Science.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for a medical doctor to be invited to be a moderator at the conference here at IVA. And this is a theme very close to my heart. Since we're at IVA, mechanical device, here I'm sure that we all can empathize with the situation, and this is not something that we want to experience. And until very recently, basically this has been our ability to do something about it. We could listen to some strange noises from the engines, and we would go to some specialist, and in the best of cases, they could do something about it before it was too late. But today, the situation is completely different. Our cars are computerized, and they are advanced diagnostic systems, and I even have an app for my car which tells me when something should be looked at in good time, and I can go to the mechanics and have it looked at. And so if this is possible for the car, obviously why don't we have it for ourselves also? So that has been our dream. And today's conference will be, the theme of this conference will be about this. How can we predict and how can we evaluate the things, the advices around our health? And we will discuss alternative medicine, we will discuss lifestyle advice, and we will discuss the state of the art regarding genetic and molecular profiling and what relation that has to our health. And we have with us today Professor Edgar Ernst. Professor Ernst is the world's first professor in alternative medicine, although he's a traditional medical doctor by training. He's the first professor in complementary medicine, and his research has focused on looking at the efficacy and safety of alternative methods to see which generate more good and which generate more harm. Professor Ernst has been embroiled in significant controversy in this area, including by challenging some of the views about alternative medicine actively supported by very strong proponents, inter alia Prince Charles. This did not necessarily endear him in all circles, but it has not stopped him from continuing his work. And he has published many books in this area, including one book together with Simon Singh, which is also translated to Swedish. It's called Trick or Treatment, Alternative Medicine on Trial. Somebody told me today what the book's name was in Swedish. I don't remember. Okay. We were also supposed to have Professor Mario Orho Melander here, but unfortunately she could not come today. Instead, the next speaker will be Dr. Emma Franz, and Emma has a research background in medical epidemiology, and in recent years she has focused on becoming an educator for the public. She's been awarded the Swedish Grand Prize for Journalism and has been named the People's Educator, Årets Folkbildare, twice. And last but not least, we will have Professor Mattias Ullén, who is on a plane or just disembarked from a plane. Oh, there is Mattias. Hi, Mattias. Well, Mattias hardly needs an introduction in this institution, as he's a bit of a rock star in the life science research community with numerous both scientific achievements and successful innovations leading to products. And since 2003, he has led an international project to map the complete human proteome and the Human Protein Atlas. And he was also the startup founding director of the Science for Lab. And he's the president of the European Federation for Biotechnology. I myself, I am Eugene Steiner, as Stefan introduced me, and it's a pleasure to start this conference. Let's see, here's the technology. Health screening, wellness testing, preventive medicine, or scam. For me, the questions that we are discussing today started when I became the CEO of a clinical laboratory company called Calab. This was in 1987. This company had pioneered wellness testing. The purpose was to find disease early and try to prevent the disease from developing. In fact, my tenure at this company risked to become very short because I was trained in modern medicine at the Karolinska Institute, and wellness testing was not at all very well regarded, not in those days and not today. And I questioned this very aggressively. But luckily, I was a scientist and the founder of the company was a scientist, so we decided to create a research project around this instead. And in fact, this is not a new question. Already 60 years ago, Socialstyrelsen, the Swedish National Board of Health entrusted the founders of Calab, Professor Gunnar Ljungner and Docent Ingmar Ljungner, to look at 100,000 individuals in the Värmland part of Sweden, looking at 12 different tests. So in those days, this was a very large number of tests. And the idea was to see whether you could predict diseases and look at what effect the different parameters that they were measuring would have on evaluating health. This was probably the first large-scale effort at doing this. And this effort garnered some international interest. And 10 years later, some 50 years ago, the WHO commissioned a report about screening methods from James Maxwell, who was then the principal medical officer at the Ministry of Health in London, in England, and Gunnar Ljungner. at the request of the WHO, they defined some important principles of screening tests, which are very much valid even today when we have completely new and advanced methods for screening. This project, led by the Ljungner brothers, actually became an industrial project in Sweden. In fact, the company AGA decided to produce the special machines that were necessary to analyze this enormous amount of analysis that were needed for this project. And here you can see the old automated analytical machines and the computers that were needed. And AGA actually sold these instruments all around the world, including to some of the world's largest laboratories in the world, including the Kaiser Permanentes laboratories in California, who bought, I think, 9 instruments in those days. Unfortunately, like many other projects, the Autokemist project never became profitable. And I spoke with Markus Storch a few years ago, and he told me laughingly how he had killed the project when he became CEO of AGA. But as I said, when I became CEO of Carlab, we had to solve this conundrum. I, who questioned it, and Ingmar Ljungner, who was a proponent of wellness screening, and we decided to utilize the enormous new computing powers that became available for us to actually look at this problem in completely new ways. And this became the Amoris project, which today comprises some 800,000 individuals and almost 36 million analyses. We managed, today it's a little bit more difficult, but still in those days we had to get the agreement of the National Health Board, of the Data Inspection Board, and many other authorities. But we managed to get the permission to link our data with various clinical outcome data, the National Cause of Death Register, for example, and also the National Censuses register, national health registers, some quality of care registers eventually, and various research registers. So we were able to correlate all of these analyses prospectively with various outcomes. And this project has been ongoing for several decades now, and has resulted in numerous papers, and has also influenced actually clinical practice, especially in the cardiovascular area. But so the question is, are we saving lives with this? Do we predict and stop disease? Unfortunately, we have not been able to show that we can actually solve the disease problems in time. In fact, this is meta-analysis by the Cochrane group, a Danish part of the Cochrane group, and their conclusion was that general health checks are unlikely to be beneficial as far as total mortality, cancer, and cardiovascular disease go. But some studies have actually shown that in certain groups, for example, in younger groups, it might be beneficial. So the jury is probably still out. Personally, I think this is a matter of that we are all different in various ways. And while it is difficult to establish value of generalized health testing in a broad population, and therefore maybe it's not valuable for society to do this, it might still be beneficial for certain individuals. So basically, the comprehensive physicals haven't been shown to improve health outcomes across broad populations, but I think it's partly due that we are still lacking understanding about the testing. Another important factor is this. There are lots of things that we know are good or bad, but we don't live by this. This picture actually shows the rate of change in smoking, and everybody knows that smoking is bad for you in various countries. And we see, in spite of all this knowledge, there's a huge variation in how much people have actually changed their behavior in the periods from 1990 to 2015. So unfortunately, in the ever wise words of Snoopy, while someday we will all die, all the other days we will not. So it's still important to understand what can we do about this. And we are not lacking in trying. Google, for example, together with some other companies, have invested a total of $2.5 billion dollars in a company called Calico, which are trying to solve the problem of death. And they are finding new tests and new methods to go for that goal. I think it's optimistic to think that this will lead to some clear-cut outcomes in the next decade or two. So, where do I stand on this? I think that health testing is actually it's a low-cost way to monitor your health. It's a good way to establish a baseline if you want to follow a trend. It could be early warning of previous undetected conditions. So to speak, a stitch in time saves 9. And it definitely could be a basis for health style advice. So why not? Well, some illnesses aren't really detectable before the symptoms. And even when they are detectable, maybe we can't do very much about them. False positive tests, however, do generate a lot of extra work and worry and maybe complications. In fact, some tests, such as whole body CT scans, for example, expose your body to unnecessary radiation without actually producing a lot of useful information. Furthermore, as any doctor will tell you, it's really the conversation between the doctor and the patient that is important. And actually, what will you do about it? Do you want to know if there's nothing you can do about it? And from the society's standpoint, it's cost inefficient. It costs a lot of money for every potential life saved. And after all, everybody really receives pretty much the same advice. Don't smoke, eat less sugar, drink less alcohol, and move a little bit more. And on this theme, I will ask Maja's help to actually mobilize this illustrious group with something that's called the Kiruna Squat.
Hello, hello? Hello? Yes, so if everyone can join me in standing up. This is something that will go on repeatedly between every speaker of today, so it's good that you know what's happening. And now that you stand up, you sit down, you stand up, sit down, as many times as you can for 20 seconds. If you get sick of it, you can sit down, or you can just do a small bend. This is scientifically proven to improve your life. Thank you very much.
And with that, I invite Professor Ernst up to the table.
I might need some help. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me to Stockholm, your wonderful town, and to this conference center, and to this very, very interesting conference. My title is so-called alternative medicine, which I abbreviate into SCAM. So before I do anything else, let me explain why I call it scam and not alternative medicine like everybody else. If we're talking about a therapy that doesn't work, it clearly isn't an alternative. Something that doesn't work can never be an alternative. And if it's a therapy that does work, it's not an alternative, but it's real medicine. And therefore I call it so-called alternative medicine scam. But I also have another reason. I have published a book with that title. And you're all going to buy it. Right. So, having clarified the title, I'm briefly showing you what I'm going to go through. I intend to give you some background. Then I'm trying to apply a little bit of science to scam. I give you an example of scam. I will ask, why do so many patients swear by something that evidently is ineffective? Then I will briefly mention that not all scams are scam. I will talk about the safety issues related to scam, the ethics. Then, if anybody is still awake, I will come to some conclusions, and then I will link it to the theme of the conference, and I will ask, how should we navigate this plethora of false information? First, about me. I was brought up on homeopathy, I'm afraid to say. Our family doctor was a homeopath, not just any homeopath, but quite a prominent homeopath in Germany. Then I studied medicine, and by coincidence, my very first job as a junior doctor was in the only homeopathic hospital in Germany at the time. There I learned how to practice homeopathy, but not just homeopathy, lots of other alternative treatments as well. Then I saw the light and became a conventional physician. I conducted some basic research, first in England and then back in Germany for about 20 years. I became a specialist in rehabilitation medicine and became chair of rehabilitation medicine in Vienna, Austria. I then got the job in Exeter, which has been mentioned, the first chair in complementary medicine in the world, and there I researched all sorts of alternative treatments, scams. I published plenty of papers, plenty of books. For those who are interested in age index, mine is pretty astronomical. I'm retired, emeritus professor since 2012, and today I give lectures, as you see. I write books, and I run a blog, which you're more than welcome to log into. So that's about me. I have hands-on training, as I mentioned, in many scams. Here's a full list, and I've done research in even more alternative treatments. Many you don't really want to know about. Our focus was on acupuncture, homeopathy, herbal medicine, and spinal manipulation, which is chiropractic and osteopathy. But we researched all these other treatments and diagnostic modalities as well. Time to define what scam is. It's actually not that easy to define. I would say it's an umbrella term for a diverse range of therapeutic, and we often forget that, diagnostic modalities, which have little in common other than being outside of the mainstream of medicine. So herbal medicine has nothing in common with acupuncture. Acupuncture has nothing in common with spinal manipulation, etc., etc. And lots of diagnostic things as well, which generally speaking, are not validated and therefore also not valid. It really goes from A to Z, from acupuncture to zone therapy, and somebody has counted 400 different modalities in this huge umbrella, under this huge umbrella that we call scam. And it's not complimentary in the sense that it's free, it's actually quite expensive. We are here at 2019 indicating, I didn't want to do that at all. The graph indicates that worldwide we spend about $80 billion per year on scam. And most of it comes out of our own pocket because the healthcare systems do not normally reimburse it. Certainly not in the UK. I'm not quite sure about Sweden. And here's a graph that gives you a comparison of the prevalence, 1 year prevalence of scam use in general populations, where we had the data. This is a fairly old slide, and you can see Sweden. We had data from 2000, and Sweden was very modest in terms of scam use. 20% of the general population used at least one scam per year. This is old data, and in preparation of this talk, I went on Medline, and I was quite speechless. This is what I found. According to this survey, which reported data from 2015, in Sweden, 71% of the general population use some form of scam. This is truly, truly amazing, and would mean that you Swedes almost beat the Germans. In Germany, it's something like 75%. In terms of research, about 120 articles per year. About 30% of these are clinical trials, and this amounts to about 1% of the worldwide output in terms of research. The focus in Sweden in terms of research seems to be on mind-body therapies. A little more background. The press has a very, very keen interest in all things alternative, I found. While I was still on active research duty in Exeter, I had at least 2 phone calls from some journalists asking me questions and interviewing me until they found something that they could publish, and then misquoted me and published something else. There are some very powerful lobby groups behind it. Certainly that is true in the UK. I'm not sure about Sweden. The consumers are bombarded with what we tend to call fake news these days. Doctors are often bypassed. They are not being consulted about alternative medicine scam. People make their own decisions without consulting doctors or other healthcare professionals. And amazingly, doctors, by and large, show very little interest in the subject. They smile a little bit and say, well, if it doesn't work, it doesn't damage the patient. That is quite wrong, as we will see in a minute. Many consumers are being turned into quasi-religious believers. If you talk to, for instance, homeopaths, you will soon find that this is a quasi-religion to many. And fallacies abound. Many, many fallacies reign in the realm of scam. And this is one fallacy. The fallacy is that even famous people, Nobel Prize winners, support scam, and therefore it must be good. Here we have. Do I have a laser pointer? The star. Okay. Okay. This is Montagnier, who has a Nobel Prize for co-finding the HIV virus, and he seems to be supportive of homeopathy. This is Linus Pauling, who has 2 Nobel Prizes. I think the only human ever to get 2. And he peace and physics, if I'm not mistaken, and then he decided to promote vitamin C for everything, including cancer. This is Gwyneth Paltrow, who makes a lot of money by trying to persuade women to do all sorts of funny things with their vagina. This is Olivia Newton-John, who's presently treating her own cancer with cannabis oil. This is Arnold Schwarzenegger, who's very fond of chiropractic. This, of course, is my friend Prince Charles. This is the fastest man on the planet, and this is the biggest quack on the planet. I'm sure you know him, Dr. Oz, who runs I think, weekly show in America promoting all sorts of outrageous quackery. More fallacies. Scam is natural and therefore it must be safe and harmless. That's what advocates of scam say. They seem to forget things like hemlock, viruses, thunderstorms, lightning, floods, all natural and all not very harmless. Scam has a long tradition and therefore it must be effective, otherwise it wouldn't have survived. You can turn this argument around and say, because acupuncture originates from 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, it is very primitive. People 2,000 years ago had no idea about physiology, for instance. Scam tackles the root cause of diseases. That you hear all the time when you talk to proponents, and by implication, in conventional medicine, we only put sticky plasters on broken bones. That, of course, is incorrect. Then this frenzy about detox, everything in scam is detox, forgetting that we have powerful organs that detox without the help of any scam. Scam can save money, where the evidence, all the best evidence shows that it's extra add-on cost. Scam cannot be squeezed into the straitjacket of science. That is something that, as a researcher, I encountered very much. Whenever a trial doesn't show what the proponents hoped it would show, they say, well, our treatment is so different, you cannot do a clinical trial with it. And scam is plausible. For that, I have a nice slide which shows you a whole mosaic of implausibility as I show it. Here's the 5-element theory for traditional Chinese medicine. Here is a little map for tongue diagnosis, showing the areas where TCM practitioners would take their clues from on the tongue. This symbolizes chiropractic. Chiropractors believe that virtually all diseases are caused by subluxations of the spine. This symbolizes ear acupuncture, where a homunculus is present in the ear, and the eye, for instance, is located here, and therefore if you have eye problems, you stick in a needle there. This is quantum bollocks from a chap called Deepak Chopra. Natural antibiotics. Many plants have antibiotic properties, but that doesn't mean this translates into the human This is not what you think it is. This refers back to Gwyneth Paltrow, who advertises vaginal steaming, and she claims that it's a traditional cure for just about anything women can suffer from. This symbolizes homeopathy. This symbolizes reflexology. Reflexologists believe that our feet are, so to speak, maps where the human body is reflected and can be influenced. All these organs can be influenced by putting pressure on the sole of the feet. Ear candling, you can detox, according to ear candlers, your body by putting a burning candle in your ear. And here we have the vitamin C story again, that it cures cancer. And here we have acupuncture, which is also used in animals, despite the fact that there's no good evidence for it and no plausibility either. Okay, let's move on. Applying science to scam. Let's remember this. Science doesn't care about beliefs. Science is beyond belief and often proves beliefs in scam entirely wrong. And the type of science that we are mostly dealing with when evaluating the effectiveness of treatments is a controlled clinical trial. Lots of people think this is a complex thing, but it is really not at all complex. Imagine a group of patients. Imagine this room here. A group. Imagine we all suffer from a similar condition. And I divide this room into two subgroups, A and B. A receives the experimental treatment, let's say acupuncture, and B receives something else or nothing at all. We let this run for a time, and then we compare whatever outcome we are interested in. This is how simple a clinical trial really is. And lots of people say, as I mentioned, you cannot run clinical trials with scam, but I haven't come across a single one where this actually is true. In fact, if you go back into the history of medicine, the very first controlled clinical trial in the history of medicine, a very important trial, was on scam. It was definitely on so-called alternative medicine. The year is 1747. Primary investigator James Lind. The condition is scurvy, which was threatening the health of many, many sailors. In fact, more sailors died of scurvy than in battle. And it was a huge problem. So James Lind decided to do a trial of 12 sailors, and he gave them all sorts of so-called alternative medicines. We would certainly call all this alternative medicine today. And almost as an afterthought, he gave 2 sailors oranges and lemons. The treatment period was very short, just 6 days. And even though this was these groups were tiny, just 2 sailors in each group, the result was so clear that he could write it up in his treatise, and it was the discovery that oranges and lemons prevents scurvy from developing in sailors. Nobody had any idea at the time that it was due to vitamin C, so you don't need to know the mechanism in order to find that a treatment is effective. And perhaps even more surprising, the first randomized clinical trial in the history of medicine was a trial of homeopathy. The year is 1835. The place is Nuremberg, and this was conducted by a society of truth-loving men in Nuremberg, a wonderful society. And it was a placebo-controlled, double-blind, randomized clinical trial, and the results were very, very clear. Homeopathic remedy was indistinguishable from the placebo. So in science, in clinical science in particular, we have a pyramid of evidence. We start with test tube experiments, animal research, finally some human studies, case studies, controlled clinical trials, randomized clinical trials. All this I've told you, and then because these randomized clinical trials by no means are all showing the same result, we need to somehow make sense out of this contradiction by pooling them together either in a systematic review or meta-analysis. So this is what we call the pyramid of evidence in conventional medicine. In scam, it looks quite different. And the top of the evidence are people who just know. They know for sure. They are religiously convinced. They do not need any evidence. This is what we are fighting on a daily basis when we are talking about scam. So let's pick out one example. I could have chosen any of the 400 treatments, but I hope I've chosen the right one, certainly the right one for me, because I know a lot about homeopathy, hopefully also an interesting one for you. Homeopathy. In 1810, Samuel Hahnemann, a German doctor, established the like cures like principle. Translated into English, he wrote, "Every medicine which produces most of the symptoms present in a given disease is capable of curing that disease." That is the like cures like principle. It sounds complicated. You need to get your head around. By the way, this is a German postage stamp which declares that Hahnemann is a helper of mankind. I doubt it a bit. I'll explain to you the like cures like principle, because the way Hahnemann expressed it, it sounds a little bit complex. It isn't complex at all. Imagine you cut an onion. Your eyes are starting to water, likely. For homeopaths, this is a sign that watery eyes, conditions that are associated with watery eyes, like common cold or hay fever, can be treated by onion. That's how simple it is. It's a true example. But they don't use the onion. That would hurt rather a lot in the eyes. They dilute it and dilute it and dilute it and dilute it. And at each dilution step, they succuss, it's called. They bang it. Hahnemann used to bang his vials on the Bible, actually. And by this process, they believe that they are transmitting something from the ingredient, say the onion, into the dilutant, and not only transmitting that information, but also enforcing that information. The process, therefore, is called potentiation, and this is what happens to the concentration. Already in the first dilution, the C1. The concentration is reduced and goes down to almost zero very, very quickly. But homeopaths would not dream of using a C1, C2, C3. They most often use a C30, 30 times diluted 1 to 100. That equals to less than 1 molecule of the onion per universe. Or expressed differently, a pill that still contains 1 single molecule of the onion would have to have a diameter larger than the distance from the sun to the earth. This is why scientists find homeopathy hard to swallow. There are plenty of clinical trials in homeopathy. And this is one which homeopaths love. It's frequently cited, and they think it's brilliant. It was conducted not far from where I worked in Bristol, and it's convincing because it's a very large group of patients, possibly the largest trial of homeopathy ever conducted. And it's homeopaths love it because 71% of patients reported positive health changes. And the conclusion, that's a quote: homeopathic treatment is a valuable intervention. Convincing? Anybody convinced? If you are, you have forgotten that this trial has no control group. Homeopathy was not the only treatment, it was an add-on very frequently to conventional care, and therefore the explanation of the positive result might be a placebo response, might be the natural history of the disease, a regression towards the mean, etc., etc. And it might have nothing at all to do with the homeopathic remedy being prescribed. This is a clinical trial that we conducted in Exeter, randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled, children with asthma. Why children with asthma? Because homeopaths believe that firstly, asthma responds to homeopathy. Secondly, children respond particularly well because they are, according to the homeopathic thinking, unspoiled by lots of other things. And that was individualized homeopathy. Classical homeopathy needs to be individualized, meaning that not all children got the same remedy, but it was tailor-made for each child, versus placebo. The main endpoint was quality of life, and the result showed no effect on quality of life at 12 months. And our conclusion, no evidence that adjunctive homeopathic remedy are superior to placebo. But if you are a fan of homeopathy, and I hope we have 1 or 2 fans here, you would say this is cherry-picked and Professor Ernst cannot be trusted anyway. So let's be clear, there's many, many more clinical trials, and it is true, today we have about 500 clinical trials. Anybody saying there's no evidence is misleading you. And the temptation when you have 500 clinical trials is, of course, to cherry pick. But I have already shown you this pyramid, and the proper way is to do a systematic review, because cherry picking is cheating in science. We have to evaluate the totality of the reliable evidence. Now let's have a look how some homeopaths do that. This is directly taken from a homeopathic website. And at the time they found not 500, but just under 200 randomized clinical trials. And they have this pie chart, and they explain to us that 41% of these trials are positive. Only 5% are negative, and 53%, 54% are inconclusive. Now that is cheating. Why? Because a clinical trial tests whether treatment works or not. So this inconclusive bracket is a complete invention, only exists in the homeopathic mind. An inconclusive clinical trial does not exist. It's either positive or it's negative. So inconclusive means not positive, means negative. So all this is negative. And then we have 59 negative and 41 positive. However, you will say, why on earth 41 positive if homeopathy is so implausible and so ridiculous? Well, there are plenty of reasons why a trial can be a trial of an ineffective treatment can come out positive. Pure chance is one reason. With conventional statistics, if you run 100 trials, 5 will be positive by chance. Then there's publication bias. If a homeopath runs a clinical trial and it's not positive, he might never publish it. That is called publication bias. Then there's poor quality. We know that poor quality trials, these positive trials tend to be the poor quality ones, and poor quality leads very often to positive results, false positive results. And then there's fraud. Like in all clinical research, there might be fraud. So there are plenty of reasons to explain this 41% figure. A while ago, I have done something rather unusual. I've done a systematic review of systematic reviews of homeopathy, because at the time there were quite a few systematic reviews. They were contradictory. Usually the ones conducted by homeopaths tended to draw a positive conclusion, etc., etc. So I did that, and you probably can't read the conclusion, therefore I have reprinted them here. The clinical evidence for homeopathy does not warrant positive recommendations for its use in clinical practice. That's a very modest expression of the fact that homeopathy is unproven. Years later, 15 years later, the Australians have done the same thing except much better. This is the National Health and Medical Research Council of Australia, 2015, and they have looked at the similar data as I did, and it's much better because, first of all, they have a better reputation than I have. Nobody can say that they are biased. Well, actually, homeopaths nowadays do, but they're certainly not biased. Secondly, at that stage, there were 53 systematic reviews. And this is their conclusion. The evidence does not show that homeopathy is effective. So, let's move on. Let's ask, why do so many patients nevertheless swear by ineffective scams? I hear this sentence so often. I don't need a scientist to tell me what works for me. I know this treatment works. This is felt sincerely, and it is an honest statement if you talk to patients. It's also a statement that you hear from clinicians, from homeopaths, for instance. And they're not lying. They see that their treatment works. How can we explain that? Well, let me try. Schematically, you have a patient or a group of patients who come to see a clinician because they have symptoms. The severity is at its top when they go into the surgery of their general practitioner or homeopath or whatsoever. there they get a treatment administered or prescribed. The treatment runs for a while, and then they see the clinician again, and the symptoms hopefully have diminished. The difference between the initial and the final severity of symptoms is what I call the perceived therapeutic effect, PTE. And what we do in healthcare, not just alternative medicine, not just scam, but in any form of medicine, we equate this with what we have done as clinicians, with this specific effect of the treatment. And that is wrong. It's quite simply wrong, because it's so much more complex. There are other factors which are just as important. The natural history of the disease, I've mentioned it already. A common cold lasts 7 days if I treat it, and a week if I don't treat it. This is what we call the natural history of the disease. A regression towards the mean, outliers, when we measure them again, come back to the mean. Hawthorne effect, the phenomenon that just by observing somebody, there will be an improvement. Concomitant treatments. Our patients usually take lots of other treatments, paracetamol, ibuprofen, God knows, depending on what they suffer from. And when they do get better, they say, it was the homeopathy that helped me. The placebo effect proper, and obviously one could write books about the placebo effect alone. And social desirability, what is that? If I'm kind to a patient, in all likelihood, that patient is gonna be kind to me again. So he comes back, and I say, "Are you any better?" And he says, "Yeah." And in fact, he might be worse. He's just kind to me. That's called social desirability. So what follows from this complicated graph is that ineffective or even slightly harmful treatments can be followed by a positive outcome. Improvement after a therapy is not the same as because of the therapy. And the plural of anecdote is anecdotes, not evidence. So, just in case you think I'm against all forms of alternative treatments, I've inserted this little journey here, saying not all scams are scam. Here is a treatment which probably works very well, but is very unpractical. In Britain, I'm seen as almost as a quackbuster. I don't feel like a quackbuster at all. What I'm doing is applying science to a field where not a lot of good science is being applied. So this quackbuster thing got on my nerves, and one day I decided to cherry pick my own positive results into one publication published in the Journal of General Practice, British Journal of General Practice, entitled Complementary and Alternative Medicine, What the NHS Should Be Funding. These are the treatments that at the time, according to our standards, were evidence-based. This is a long time ago, 10 years ago, and I'm sure you can't read the table, and you shouldn't be reading the table because it's outdated. A few days ago, I published this book, and there I did more or less the same thing again, except I reviewed 150 modalities, and to my pleasant surprise, some of them came out as being as generating more good than harm, with a positive risk-benefit balance. And these are obviously herbal treatments. The best evidenced herbal treatment is St. John's wort for depression. Lots of dietary supplements. Think of glucosamine. then something really strange, oil pulling, which is swishing oil in your mouth, and it works against gingivitis, not against lots of other claims. Alexander treatments, which might work for back pain, might help Parkinson's patients. Massage therapy, which might help back pain again. Pilates, which might help get you fitter, and again, back pain. Laughter therapy, mindfulness, progressive muscle relaxation. Relaxation being a strong element in many of these treatments that actually do have an effect. Right, safety. Everybody seems to think that alternative treatments, they may not work, but they cannot do much harm. Well, I'm going to refute that by showing you my mosaic of horror. This chap decided to take colloidal silver and changed his outlook and appearance quite a lot. This is an abscess after acupuncture. This is several abscesses after cupping therapy. This is to remind us that after spinal manipulation, these arteries might dissect, and in actual fact, there are hundreds of cases where this has happened. This is mostly chiropractic that I'm talking about. And when this happens, you have a stroke and or die. And this is to remind me of acupuncture. The most common serious complications of acupuncture is a pneumothorax. Lots of acupuncture points around here on the thorax, very close to the lungs. And the needle can easily go into the lung and deflate the lung, which is called the pneumothorax. And acupuncturists often stick needles symmetrically. So what can happen if you're really unlucky, you have a pneumothorax on both sides, and then you need to be in an emergency department very quickly if you want to survive. So these are some direct adverse effects, serious adverse effects. But I'm not saying that these are frequent, and I'm not saying that, certainly not saying that these are more frequent than adverse effects with conventional medicine. For me, the much more important risks are indirect risks, namely serious conditions not being treated properly because some alternative practitioner is treating them. And this is called medically called neglect. The most impressive data, recent data, comes from America on cancer patients. This is the publication if you want to look it up. And these guys have followed cancer patients who used SCAM and compared them to cancer patients who didn't use SCAM. And you see that the survival curve goes down considerably faster in the SCAM group. And considering that 30 to 100% of cancer patients use some form of SCAM, this is extremely worrying. The risks, these indirect risks, are best studied when it comes to vaccinations. This is just one very small study, small but important, not least important because it almost cost me my job at Exeter because I was accused of conducting unethical research and was investigated, etc., etc. Anyway, that's a different story. We contacted by email 104 homeopaths, and we pretended to be a mother worried at the height of the MMR crisis, asking whether we should vaccinate our child. Lots of these homeopaths withdrew after we had debriefed them that actually they were misled, and this was a research project, so we could evaluate 77 responses, and only 3% advertised to immunize our child. 40% advised us not to immunize, and the rest were somewhere nebulously in between. And that is a small survey, yet important because it shows something that has been confirmed across the world. Lots of alternative therapists advise against vaccination, particularly after this guy, Andrew Wakefield, a British doctor who published in the Lancet the link between MMR vaccination and autism, and was later discovered to be fraudulent, was thrown out of the GMC, had to leave the country, and now makes a fortune by advertising lots of nonsense in America. And here he is with his newfound friend, who confirmed that there's a link with vaccination and autism. And these clinicians all have been shown over and over again to at least be skeptical, over-skeptical of routine vaccination program. Physicians practicing integrative medicine, doctors of anthroposophical medicine, which I think in Sweden is quite important, naturopaths, homeopaths I've showed you, and chiropractors. They tend to advise their patients against vaccinating their kids. And this is, if you don't remember anything, please do remember this slide. If used as an alternative for an effective treatment, even a harmless therapy can become life-threatening. I think this is very important. And with that statement, we are right in the middle of medical ethics already, which is, I think, one of the last points that I'm trying to cover. A few months ago, we published this book, which is solely about ethics. I published it together with Kevin Smith, who is a formidable ethicist in Aberdeen. And the book covers all these subjects, and I'm going to just pick out one in the interest of time: informed consent. You have seen this before, what the Australians said about homeopathy, so I use homeopathy again. Imagine I, as a homeopath, am prescribing homeopathy to one of my patients. I have to say the following: I give you this remedy, it will help you. Please take it regularly until you feel better. Trust me, I'm a doctor. If I say this, he will take it, he will trust me because I'm a doctor, but I'm lying through my teeth. If I'm honest and ethical, I have to say, this is a homeopathic remedy. It contains no active ingredient. The best clinical evidence fails to show that it works, but take it anyway. So if I say that, he won't take it, will he? So I've got to lie as a homeopath. Proper informed consent for most scams is just not possible. It would discourage patients from accepting the treatment. Therefore, it's against the interest of the practitioner and against the cash flow of the practitioner. Therefore, it simply does not happen. And we have very little data to support this, that it doesn't happen. The only data that I know of is with chiropractors in the UK. This was a survey of randomly chosen UK chiropractors. Only 23% always discuss serious risks of chiropractic. And I've mentioned that what the serious risks are, namely to die. Valid consent procedures are either poorly understood or selectively implemented by UK chiropractors. That was the conclusion. published not by myself, but by a chiropractor in a chiropractic journal. So, the end is near. Conclusions. The amount of misinformation about scam is staggering. I've just managed to show you a little bit about it, but believe me, it's staggering. You go on the internet, 50 million websites, practically all of them mislead consumers and patients. Most forms of scam lack plausibility. Evidence regarding efficacy is mixed and frequently negative. Scam is by no means devoid of risk. Few scams generate more good than harm, and much of the practice is unethical. Right. To bring this back into the theme of the conference, how should we navigate this fake news about scam, the abundant fake news about scam? That's the question with which I want to finish. It is an important question because regardless in what area, the deniers of science use very much the same techniques. They ignore scientific consensus, they cherry pick, they rely on poor quality studies and pretend they're high quality studies. They invent conspiracy theories. Big Pharma is out to ditch us, that sort of stuff. I'm paid by Big Pharma, of course. They claim opponents are corrupt, incompetent, etc. They point out that science has been wrong before. It's not the first time that they make a mistake. They say science does not know everything, and they tell lies. Hoppla. Yes, they do tell lies. So how do we navigate that? What can we do? I wish I had the answers, but that's what I can offer. Ideally, we should stop fake facts from being published and promoted. We must promote and provide accurate information about scam and all other areas of science as well. We must educate consumers to understand, be vigilant, and think critically. And critical thinking should be taught, in my view, at school level already. That's what I've been doing for the last 10 years. Please visit my blog. This is my next book, which I've just delivered the manuscript to the publisher out in April, I think, and it's exactly about the subject. Don't believe what you think. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ernst. I'll open up for the public to ask some questions, but I want to ask you one thing. You basically answered all the questions that I had written up already, but you say that in Sweden, for example, 71% of people are actually using scam. Today, in the past, the doctor was an authority, and you listened to your doctor, and you basically did what the doctor told you, whether it was a good doctor or a bad doctor. Today, many patients are very well read about their disease, their situation, maybe even better read up than their doctor. So why do you think that so many people still fall into the trap of alternative medicines?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a question that I don't hear for the first time, as you can imagine. And there's not one answer. There are dozens of answers. One answer surely must be that patients, consumers are being misled, constantly misled by the internet, etc., etc. But one point that I would like to stress is equally serious. Patients go to scam practitioners because they hope to get something which they do not get from conventional practitioners, conventional doctors. And that is important because it means we can actually learn something as conventional practitioners from the scammers. We can learn about having time, having compassion, having empathy. I think that conventional medicine has become dehumanized to a certain degree, and the popularity of scam reminds us that this is the wrong path. If we delegate empathy to quacks, we shoot in our own feet.
Thank you. Maybe some questions from the audience.
Wonderful talk, I must say. So one of the problems I guess we have had in the one of the problems we've had in the last 10 years is the rise of social media and influencers, and that a lot of the people are sort of selectively reading things from internet, as you say. So what can we as scientists do about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Pretty unanswerable, but good. The internet is fairly out of control, but if you listen to the news in the last few days, I think they're trying to do something about it because not just science, but politics is being misled by this, and they have realized Google and what's the other one? YouTube. They are realizing how dangerous all this is, and in terms of alternative medicine, they are looking at their algorithms. So nobody wants to curtail free speech, but with these popular media, there's an amplifying effect, and they somehow want to create algorithms where this is being stopped. So somebody makes an outrageous claim, I have a cancer cure, and so forth, and that doesn't explode anymore into a million messages, but stays as one message of some lunatic who should best not be listened to. Other attempts are to give sort of quality signs of approval from scientific organizations like this one to websites on health information, and I think that already exists and is a good approach. But the consumer may not know that these quality signals do exist. So it's very, very difficult because nobody wants to curtail free speech, but we have realized that certain things have gone way too far in politics and in health.
Please.
Don't you think that the growing belief in scams that you're talking about has something to do with the fact that modern medicine is not very good at curing people? Sickness is going up like a pandemic. Metabolic sickness is going up. Cancer is increasing, diabetes is increasing, heart disease is increasing, Alzheimer's is increasing, and you medical scientists have no solution on that. Your science has not been able to stop this epidemic. And what happens then? People distrust you. Can't you understand that?
Yes, I can very well understand that because I get this distrust at almost every public lecture that I give. But what you're I would very much dispute of what you're saying. You say cardiovascular disease is increasing. It's not. It's decreasing. You say health generally is getting worse and worse. It's not. Life expectancy is higher than it was. At Hahnemann's time, if you had an appendix, it was a death sentence. If you had diabetes, it was a death sentence. It isn't anymore. Life expectancy was way below 40 years. Now it is higher than 70 years. I'm not currently familiar with the figures in Sweden, but I think it is higher than, for men at least, higher than 70 years, for women even higher. So your basic assumption is wrong, and what you are creating is a straw man argument. It's a logical fallacy, what you are stating.
Go ahead.
Life expectancy for the poor people in Western countries is going down. It's turning down. In the United States, the total life expectancy has turned down. In Sweden, the poor part of the population, there it's going down. And that it went up in the beginning during the 1900s has to do with antibiotics. And now the antibiotics doesn't solve the problem any longer. And we have a great problem with resistant bacteria. And you haven't solved these problems. People are getting sicker and sicker. And more people die from these diseases. That is a fact. You can go to the World Health Organization's statistics and the proof is there. So I don't agree with you. And turn to me and say that it is incorrect what I'm saying.
It is incorrect what you're saying, because
it is not incorrect.
Can I respond to you, please?
Yes.
In your response, you say the life expectancy in certain subgroups is going down.
Yes.
Yeah, fine. I don't know that data, but life expectancy in the general population is going up. It is higher than it ever was, and you can discuss with me the causes for that. The causes are obviously complex, and it is not just medicine, but medicine has made a huge contribution, the biggest of which must be immunization.
I think that
in the United States it's going down for the medium of the population.
I think that what you are referring to is many of the lifestyle diseases that we have. So a lot of the medical knowledge that that is well known is not utilized by all groups in the population. That does not mean that medicine has not met the requirements of actually finding if not solutions, at least explanations for disease. But I think we are now standing between you and coffee. So I propose that, Maja, is that true? Yeah? So I propose that we pause this conference and take some coffee. Ladies and gentlemen, I have already introduced Emma, but I will shortly do it again. Emma has a research background in medical epidemiology, and she has focused in recent years to become an educator of the public. And she's published several books about how to distinguish between good and bad science. And she was awarded the Swedish Grand Prize for Journalism twice. And she recently had her own radio program this summer. Emma, please.
Thank you very much. So I changed the title a bit. Food and lifestyle trends. Is it our new religion? Because in some ways I think these trends are actually quite similar to religion. And as you heard, I'm a medical researcher, that's my background, but I've been working with these questions about disinformation in the media and online. And I became interested in these questions when I myself got on social media and noticed that there were a lot of strange claims circulating online. For instance, during the Ebola epidemic 2014 in West Africa, there were actually people that I myself follow in social media that claimed that something called colloidal silver could be used to prevent and even cure Ebola, even though there's no scientific evidence supporting this claim. And I think you have heard some, I think you saw a picture even on the potential toxic effects of drinking this kind of colloidal silver. But sometimes this colloidal silver is very much diluted and you're basically drinking water. And of course, drinking water is not dangerous for your health, but the problem is that the ones who are advocating these alternative treatments are also saying that you should avoid the evidence-based treatments, and then it's quite problematic. And we are experiencing the effects of this disinformation. As you might know, these anti-vaccination groups has been very successful in spreading disinformation on these digital platforms. They are, for instance, sharing this kind of misleading statistic that could make someone believe that there's a link between vaccine and autism. And this is something that researchers has been studying extensively, and they haven't been able to show a link between autism and vaccine, except for this one study that was published in The Lancet in the late 1990s, showing a link between measles vaccine and autism-like symptoms. But it later became evident that this was due to fraud, and this researcher behind this study had received funding from advocates who wanted to sue the vaccine manufacturers. And when this became evident, this study was retracted. But even though the study has been retracted, this misconception continues to spread. And this has become a huge problem. We are now seeing the largest outbreaks of measles in Europe for decades, and countries who has previously been free of measles are now very much affected, and WHO has also said that this is one of the largest threats towards public health. So this is the problem with the digital medias and the things that are circulating in social media. But of course, there are also sometimes strange claims being spread through the more traditional media, and there's a lot of exaggeration circulating, and sometimes these studies are based actually on science, but they are being exaggerated, and you might have noticed these kind of like cancer headlines. Sometimes you can't even open the magazine without seeing that everything causes cancer. Things that we are not really thinking as dangerous towards our health, like drinking juice or mashed potato. I was very surprised. I thought potatoes were good for us, but if you eat the purple potatoes, you can cut your colon cancer risk. So sometimes you see these cancer headlines. Something that I've noticed recently is that there are a lot of claims about things, lifestyle factors being dangerous towards your health and as dangerous as smoking. So these things, because everyone knows nowadays that smoking is bad for your health. So this is something that is being used in a way of telling us that something is very bad for our health. This was something that I saw recently in Swedish media. I found it as well in English-speaking media. Being single, worse than smoking, might surprise some people and may also maybe scare some people. you might be in a bad relationship and you won't get a divorce because you might be very scared of being single, and then you will be very surprised the next day when you see that being in a bad marriage isn't healthy at all. It's also as bad for your health as smoking. And this is probably something that you've heard, the dangers of sitting down, and of course scientists knows that it's very good for your health to exercise, and prolonged sitting isn't good for you, of course. And this is something that a lot of employers try to solve by getting these desks so that you can stand up and work. And they must have been very disappointed when they saw this headline: standing and working is just as unhealthy as smoking cigarettes. So we get these mixed signals because the journalists, they do a selection of the studies, and they also liked to select these studies that are kind of contradicting each other. So we have all these misconceptions, exaggerations, and also fake health news circulating. And who's to blame? Well, I think it's quite easy to blame the journalists, and they are, of course, quite under pressure. Media's under pressure right now, and they are competing with the digital medias. So they are formulating headlines that they know will get a lot of clicks, and they are measuring this statistically, and they can see that the ones that are kind of exaggerating and also quite alarmistic are the ones getting a lot of attention. And there's also less money, and there's also not as many journalists that are educated within medicine and health. And also, as you can see here, there are more and more studies being published. So we have less people with less education writing about much more research being made. So we can blame the journalists, but I also think that we have to talk about the problems within academia, because we have this kind of publish or perish system, and a lot of researchers, when they do this public outreach, they are trying to do kind of PR for their own research. And I think this was a very interesting study being published in British Medical Journal, BMJ, showing that when you saw this exaggeration in health-related news, it was quite often so that the exaggerations were present already in the press release. So the problem arises even before it reaches the journalists. And as you can see here, the kind of exaggerations that were found was exaggerations when it came to health advice, also exaggerated health claims, and exaggerations when inferencing research from animal studies to humans. So the disinformation and exaggerations are coming from these very different directions. And I have tried to work with these kind of problems by doing these fact checks. So I'm a writer for Svenska Dagbladet, a Swedish newspaper, and I do fact checking to see whether there is scientific evidence supporting a claim or not. But I think, as I've been mentioning before, the problem is that when a false claim has been spread, it's quite difficult to get people to stop believing in this claim. And there is even research showing something called the backfire effect. So when you confront people who have this misconception with true facts, they are not. They can be even more sure that this false claim is true. So it's when this disinformation has been spread, it might even be too late to do this kind of fact checking. So therefore, I think it's very important to work preventive with these issues by teaching people how they can be better fact checkers themselves. So how can you become better at knowing what is true and what is false? And I think it's impossible to do that in all the time, but I think everyone can become better in knowing what is credible information and what is not. So firstly, I think it's very important that we always remind ourselves that we are not always rational and we sometimes get things wrong. We are affected by our emotions, and we also have these cognitive biases that are affecting us. And I think something that is quite important when it comes to health and lifestyle is something called confirmation bias. And I also think that this is a big problem in this digital era that we are living in, because confirmation bias means that we have this kind of we are very selective, and we are very good at noticing information that confirm our pre-existing beliefs, and we deny the things that go against our worldview. And this is something that we have always been prone to, but nowadays we have this huge digital, we have internet, so it's easier. It's very, very easy nowadays to go out and find a source that are supporting what you already believe, even if what you believe is completely wrong. And then we became even more sure that this falsehood is true. And we are also living in a time where we have these influencers, these very famous people that are not always good at checking the facts. And we have this cognitive bias called halo effect, meaning that if we like somebody, we are prone to believing that they know a lot of things, that they are more competent and have more knowledge than they actually do. And I've illustrated this with a picture that I've taken from Danny Saucedo's Instagram account. So this is a very famous Swedish pop star. And he has a lot of followers on Instagram. He has hundreds and thousands of followers, so he's got more followers than the biggest media houses. And he is spreading disinformation about how if you don't eat vegan food, your blood will become acid, and then there will arise cancer mushrooms. So he's not really good at, so even though he's a very good pop star, he is not very knowledgeable when it comes to medicine, as you can see here. And it's especially problematic with somebody who is this influential, is spreading this kind of disinformation. And this is something that we have seen. A lot of celebrities are actually responsible for spreading a lot of falsehood when it comes to health and lifestyle. And one could guess that Danny suffers from this bias that we like to call overconfidence bias. And it's not only Danny who is overestimating his own knowledge. This is a tendency that we have seen generally. People are prone to overestimating how much knowledge they have. So I think it's important to be humble towards your own pre-existing beliefs, and to not only question the sources, but also question yourself. But it's of course also important to always remembering checking the facts, and I think people are quite bad at checking the facts. For instance, it's always important to find the original source of a claim, so I always remind people that find the original source. Reminding them of this whispering game, it illustrates very clearly how a claim tends to change the further you get from the original source. And you can see the same kind of whispering game in the media, and a lot of journalists do this kind of rewrites, and for each rewrite you can see that it comes kind of further away from the truth. And when you find your sources, you should, of course, scrutinize them and look for potential conflicts of interests. I did myself this kind of fact-checking article about whether breakfast is the most important meal of the day. You probably heard that. Do you believe in it? Yes? No? But there is research showing that there's a link between good health and low BMI and eating eating a good breakfast. But it could be, since we've been taught that breakfast is the most important meal of the day, people who are living a very healthy lifestyle are also the ones eating a lot of breakfast. But they are also the ones staying away from tobacco and alcohol and exercising and eating healthy. So this could be the true explanation to this correlation. And when researchers have done some smaller studies where this randomized study it was up to chance who ate the most in the beginning of the day or in the end of the day. And in these studies, they didn't see any changes in BMI or some markers for health. But I found this study that showed that people who had cereals for breakfast were more healthy and had a lower BMI compared to those who skipped breakfast or those who had egg and bacon as breakfast. And this study was actually sponsored by Kellogg's. And this doesn't mean, of course, that it's false or fake news, but it's important to remember that an independent study or an independent source is more reliable than somebody who has something to gain on making this kind of claim. And of course, it's good to remind everyone that it's always important to not only go to one source, but to look, is there another source confirming this, and try to look at the research as a whole, and not only talk to one expert, but to try to talk to look at what are the most experts saying within an area. And this is quite well illustrated by this with global warming, whether humans are responsible for global warming, because you might get a false impression of what the expertise are saying if you only talk to the person right down in the right corner who doesn't believe that humans are affecting global warming. And when it comes to these cancer alarms, it's also important to see who this research is conducted on, because, as I mentioned, quite often it's based on animal research, and and this doesn't necessarily mean that this is informative when it comes to humans. And these pictures are taken from a study who resulted in headlines about GMOs, genetically modified foods, causing cancer. And it was a study where these rats were fed genetically modified corn, but it later became evident that these rats were of a certain type that spontaneously developed tumors. And when this became evident, the study was retracted. But even though the study has been retracted, these pictures continue to circulate online and are being shared by those who want to ban all GMOs. It's also important to remember that what does it actually mean by something increases the risk of a negative outcome? This was a study that Ekot in Sweden reported, and it was a study showing that even slight overweight during pregnancy might result in malformations in the child. And this is something that I think scares a lot of women, but when you go to the original source and look at what this study actually showed, the risk for some sort of malformation in normal weight mothers was 3.4%, whereas the risk in the overweight women was 3.5%. So it's a very, very small risk increase, and it isn't really relevant it's not relevant for a specific individual. And also, as I mentioned in this BMJ article, there are also being those who doesn't clearly separate between correlation and causality. And I use this example to illustrate this. You might have seen how a lot of studies are reporting about the health benefits of drinking coffee. I myself believe this because I drink coffee and I want to believe that it's good for my health. And it could be that coffee has certain compounds like antioxidants that improves the health and make you live longer, but it could also be due to this reverse causality when it comes to certain diseases, such as Parkinson's disease. One early symptom might be problems with sleeping, and when you can't sleep, you might stop drinking that last cup of coffee during the day, or maybe decrease your coffee consumption altogether. Other diseases might be linked to nausea, and when you're nauseous, you might not be in the mood for drinking coffee. So it could be that poor health is causing decreased coffee consumption, making it look like it's very healthy for you to drink coffee. And as you know, there might be confounders affecting these correlations that we see. There is a strong correlation, for instance, between ice cream sales and people drowning. And this, of course, doesn't mean that it's dangerous to eat ice cream. At least it won't make you drown. There's this confounder, and you might all know what I'm thinking about. Summer, or even in summer, you can see a difference depending on the weather. So when the weather is hot, we buy our ice cream and we also go swimming. And when we go swimming, there's an increased risk that someone will drown. So if you control for this weather factor, this correlation disappears. And when it comes to these kind of health studies, there are often looking at correlations and not causality. There is, of course, ways of assessing the causality. You can do this kind of randomized trial when people are randomized to different interventions or different types of diets or lifestyle changes. And then you can actually investigate whether there's a causal correlation or not. But this is not always easy to do. It costs a lot of money, and often you want to know the long-term effects, and then it might be very difficult to do these randomized trials. And also, it might be of ethical reasons problematic to do this kind of intervention studies when it comes to diet and lifestyle factors. And I think you have all probably heard about the Vipeholm experiments, because this was actually an example where they did this kind of intervention to see how the health was affected by the diet, and they wanted to investigate if sugar causes dental cavities. And they did this in this hospital called Vipeholm. This was a hospital where people who had intellectual disability lived, and they fed these people with this special sticky fudge that would get stuck to their teeth. And as you might guess, this resulted in a lot of dental problems and a lot of dental cavities. And this was, of course, good research when it comes to finding out whether sugar actually causes these kind of dental problems, but of course it wasn't a very ethical experiment. And nowadays we wouldn't do this kind of research. So therefore we have to be quite humble about these kind of research that we can do concerning lifestyle factors and health. And I think it's very important also to think about these ethical issues, because in this world where we have all this information and it can be very difficult to people to understand what is true and what is false, it's very important also to talk about trust, because I think we have a natural tendency to go to the ones we trust when we want answers to the difficult questions in our lives. And therefore, I think it's very important to try to build trust with the public, not only towards specific scientists or specific researchers, but very much for the scientific method, and that people should trust the scientific method. Because as Richard Feynman very clearly put it, science is actually methods to understand how the world actually works, and it is what we have learned about how to keep from fooling ourselves, because we have this natural tendency of fooling ourselves. And that was all I had to say. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Emma. So you have taught us a lot about what biases we have fooling ourselves, basically. But it seems there is something more here. For example, vegetarians. I'm not a vegetarian, so maybe that's an unfair choice of. But in different diets, for example, people become almost religious. It's almost as if their identity is connected to the life choices they are making, and probably also with training and things like that. Could you comment on that?
Yes, I think we kind of believe that this only has to do with fact and not getting the facts right. But I think, as you say, it's very closely linked to our identity. So when somebody says that you've been doing things wrong, it's not only, it's a threat towards you as a person in your identity, and therefore I think it's even more difficult when it comes to these kind of diets and lifestyle changes. So I think it's as in my headline, this is in some senses our new religion, and also that people have these kind of communities, these closed Facebook groups where they also they go to each other for information instead of going to the true experts. So I think it's the comparison with religion is quite good, actually.
Questions? I think you made everything outstandingly clear for everybody.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Sorry, there was a question. Sorry. Not yet. Go ahead. Use the mic, please. Yeah, now.
Yes. This is an opener for further discussions, but how do we know that something is bad for us? What's the terms? So I'm interested to hear that later on. How long do we try something before we know it's bad for us? We said there that smoking is bad for us, but we have many other things which are not that clear. And how do we know that they are bad for us? So
yeah, I think that we can come back to that question.
Yeah.
I think it's a very good question. Thank you very much, Emma.
Thank you.
And now I would invite Matthias to come up.
Okay. Does someone help me now? Will you start the thing? Okay, so now for something completely different, as Monty Python usually says. So what I have been asked to do is to talk a little bit about, can all of these new technologies help us to profile human beings and also to help us in better health in different ways. And since this is going to be quite heavy science, I thought I would at least start with a little bit of a movie, so at least you kind of don't feel asleep too early. So what I'm showing now is a wonderful movie from our group, I think. I'm a little bit biased here, showing a tissue, an organ in the human body. And since there's a lot of scientists in this room, I want you to think about where can we be? And this organ has been stained with for two proteins, one red and one green. And I can tell you the red ones stands for nerves, but we are not in the brain. So where are we? And what is this green stuffs which is in the human body? I can tell you it's one of the most famous proteins in the human body. I will tell you in the end of the lecture. So now you have to stay awake. So precision medicine is of course, you want to have the right treatment for the right patients. It's kind of obvious, but it's damn hard. We have more targeted treatments lately. They are very expensive, so it would be very important to know which one actually benefits from them. But what we are working a lot on is better diagnostic methods for analysis of health and disease. And this is what I will talk a little bit about. I'm coming from the Science for Life laboratory at the Karolinska campus. It is a way for us it's an infrastructure to do a lot of technology-driven research. I was the founding director for the first 6 years, and it's been a fantastic journey where we've gone from, I was the employee number 1, and now we are 1,200 people, and we are actually running about 3,000 projects every year. One of the reasons we started this, and again this is a kind of a self-boosting slide, is the fact that DNA sequencing has become so cheap. The first genome that was done costed about 25 billion SEK, or about a little bit more than $2 billion. Now we can do it at Science for Life for 10,000 crowns. This is an absolutely amazing. Unfortunately, it hasn't led to very much clinical utility, but I will come back to that. So when we are looking at diagnostic tools in the hospital and primary care, technology is rapidly going forward. We are just amazed about all the new knowledge that we're getting. But actually, when it comes to the implementation in the clinical setting, it's been rather poor. So what we actually, when you go to a primary care doctor today, vårdcentral, actually most of the analysis which is done is analysis that was done 40 years ago or 30 years ago. And a lot of them are the classical ones. We have new analysis, and I guess in the medical imaging is going fantastically forward. But actually, in most cases, a lot of the diagnostics in the clinical setting is a little bit like was said before. Take this pill, come back in 2 weeks, we see if it works. If it doesn't work, you change. So obviously what we would like to have is better diagnostics, better ways to actually stratify patients. I thought I would just put in a disclaimer here, because what I will show some data from 2 of the companies that I founded, so just so you know that I'm biased also there. And then I'm going to give you 3 different stories. I'm going to give you an update of the Human Protein Atlas because I just love this program. I'm going to then talk about wellness profiling, the way we do it and what we have learned. and then I will say a little bit about this disease profiling, but I'm going to keep it to what we have learned in our group. So what we're trying to do in this Swedish project, and I think many of you have heard it before, is to make a periodic table of the building blocks of humans. The proteins are the building blocks of the human beings. All of you in this room has about 19,669 proteins, and they are more or less targets for all pharmaceutical drugs. But they're also targets for most of the future precision medicine efforts. So obviously it's very important to know about the proteins. We started actually 16 years ago, funded by the Wallenberg, and basically our humble way is to try to go through these proteins one by one and then see where are they in the human body. This has been very much a Swedish Asian project, and it's very nice to have several groups in Sweden working on this, but then we also have people in South Korea and so on. We are producing a lot of images. These are just from this summer, and we actually learn now to color these pictures with different types of stainings. And you can see how wonderful we look in the small intestine, don't you think? But also this is a very nice picture of the brain. We have decided, and the Wallenberg Foundation has decided, all of this information should be in the public domain. And as a basic science, it is wonderful to have more than 300,000 visitors, researchers, coming to this Swedish site every month. And actually, it's close now to 15 publications every day that are citing this. And obviously, this is wonderful as a basic scientist. Just a few days ago, we actually had a big splash. We had a release party, and that's what you know, if you're not a musician, at least as a scientist, you can have release parties now and then. And we released then 3 new atlases. And I'm not going to say very much about them, just to say that one of them is a blood atlas, trying to understand what are the proteins which are in the blood, and we hope this will be very useful for the scientific community. And then we're also launching a brain atlas, where we are looking into the brain and see what proteins are in the different parts of the brain. When we did this work, we also started working a lot with these 3D movies. And I thought I would give you 2 more movies at this point to make you stay awake. And one is then a movie of an enzyme in something called human locus coeruleus. And these are the neurons, actually, which are causing narcolepsy, which is a problem when you have problems with sleep. And what you can see in these movies, this is not an animation. We're actually flying around like a helicopter in a brain, in this case from the Karolinska Hospital. I should maybe say that this person has died, so we don't cause too much problems. Now something happened here. Oops. Okay, let's go. So these are the neurons. So this is a healthy brain. But then I'm going to show you a horror movie. So those of you who are sort of light-hearted should probably close your eyes now. And now we're looking at a patient here in Stockholm that has Alzheimer. And what you can see then is the neurons in green here, but you also see these red devilish things here, and these are the beta amyloids. And you can see in this brain how it's just full of this beta amyloids. It's quite scary. So with that, I'm going to go over and talk a little bit about wellness profiling then. So what we are trying to do is then to use this knowledge that we got from the protein atlas to try to stratify patients and try to see what is the variability between us in this room and so on. Well, maybe not in this room, but anyway. We try to combine the classical diagnostics that we learned, during 100 years with the medical imaging and also then add on these new omics technologies, which is very these new ways of looking at proteins. This is led by Lynn Fagerberg, who is in the audience, and she has a very talented group of 2 postdocs and a PhD student. And this kind of small group is actually doing wonderful stuff, and I will show you some. This is a collaboration funded by the Heart and Lung Foundation. It's based on a biobank study called SCAPIS, where 30,000 people in Sweden has come in and done a medical imaging in a very, very extensive way, and then they are followed by registers. What we have done as a pilot, and that's what I will talk about today, and also some other stuff, is then to follow 100 of those and actually follow them every 3 months for 2 years, and then let them come into the nurse. They have to give a lot of blood and other things, answer questionnaires, and then we'll see what happens to a person during 2 years. And these people are between 50 and 65, so this is, of course, the time when you start to fall apart, which is, of course, very good. Isn't that true? Yes. Anyway, these people, which are in Gothenburg, I think they are the most studied people on this planet right now. So we've done a lot of different analysis. So they came in the first time in October, and then these are all the visits when they see a nurse, and it took us about 2.5 years, and then we followed these people for then each one of them for 2 years. What we try to do then is to see these are supposed to be healthy individuals. It turns out that 70% of them actually were not healthy. They had some sort of disease that they have to be treated for. But what we're trying to do then is to then define a wellness profiling. And I have to say, I don't think that we have completely succeeded. We're using Swedish technology. There is a company in Uppsala which is now the world leader of doing protein profiling in blood. It's called Olink. And I'm just amazed that Sweden seems to over and over again create technology that is then spread out and used in the world. So this is just the first example then of the 100 patients that we followed. You can see the females to the left and the males to the right. These are dynamic plots, so they show the 6 visits during 2 years, and each line here represents then one person. So, for example, you can see a very famous protein, leptin, which is an indicator of fat and BMI. You can see that this individual has very low levels of leptin, and it's sort of kept that low levels during 2 years. And you can see that in most cases, the individuals have a rather constant level during 2 years, but you can also see there is quite a big spread. And the normal way for diagnostics today is to say the females have higher levels than the males, and this is represented by this medium line, which is blue. But what you can also see that there are females that has much lower than the medium of the males. So basically what this shows is that you should not be compared to the population, you should be compared to yourself 1 year earlier. And this is, of course, very important for us to kind of get a feeling for that each one of you has its own kind of profile. So this is done with this Olink technology and proteins profiling, but we also have thrown them everything we have at SciLife Lab. And these are now wonderful plots. They have been created by Abdella, who's in the audience. And they are quite complicated. These are kind of modern PCA plots. And so what you try to do in this case, you try to take almost 1,000 protein levels and put them together in a 2-dimensional map. that gives you a specific individual's sort of fingerprint of those profiles. And what you can see here, we can easily separate the blue guys, which are the males, from the females. But you can also see something rather extraordinary. And this is now during, I think it's during 2 years, that each individual is different from each other. So each one of you in this room has your own fingerprint, your own protein profile in the blood, and it is constant, because that's why it is sort of stays in the same spot. But then you can also see that some guys are actually changing. And this is, of course, because things are happening. And this is, of course, very interesting. You can see sort of the same thing with clinical chemistry. Autoantibodies are the own antibodies to your own stuff. Nothing happens in 2 years. It's absolutely dead boring. But you can also see here the microbiome is the bacteria in your intestines. You can see that there's a lot of things happening. You can also see the immune cells are changing quite a lot, and the lipidome and so on. So what this gives you a snapshot what is happening in 100 people, and you can also see that in almost all cases you are more you are different from the person sitting next to you. So this is normal people then, and we are very interested to continue and try to understand what this means. But we also looked in diseases, and we're taking then the same type of analysis and looked in different types of diseases. And I thought I would give you just a glimpse of this, and I should maybe say that all of this data is unpublished, so you're kind of a privileged group here. So one thing which we find rather interesting is to look at preterm children. We had a fantastic pilot in Gothenburg at the Sahlgrenska, where people that have been born very early, 22nd week, and only weighed 400 grams, and they come out of a mother, and then you're looking in the blood how they look. And I can assure you it's not so easy to take blood from these children, but we only need about 1 microliter of blood, so it was actually possible to do this analysis. We found something rather extraordinary, I think, and these are 14 babies that are very different, but what you can see when you do this kind of profiling, they are very similar to each other. Then you can see only a week later they move in this plot, which means that their protein profile has changed quite a lot. And then they move into this blue part here, which is after 40 weeks. So you can see this very dramatic shift of protein profiles. And you can also do this by these dynamic plots, where you start when you're born the first day up here in the yellow, and then you move down here very quickly. So what about diseased people then? So we were very fortunate that Skapis, this project that investigated 30,000 people based on personal number, there was quite a lot of them were diagnosed with type 2 diabetes that they didn't know about. So obviously this gave us a very good opportunity then to analyze them before they start treatment. So basically the standard treatment with this is metformin, and then you give lifestyle advice, and then you follow them. So what happens then, hopefully, is that these are the wellness people that I talked, well, the healthy guys and the glucose levels. And here is these with a newly diagnosed type 2 diabetes, much higher levels of glucose. And then they start treatment. Already after 1 month, the glucose levels goes down. And after 3 months, it also goes down. As you can see, not really down to the normal levels. So what about the protein profiles in these guys then? So here, this is the healthy individuals, and you can see that they are very stable in this case during 2 years. These are the people that are getting treated with metformin, during a 3-month period. And you can see a lot of things are happening in these plots. But you can also see that some individuals stay very stable, while others are changing a lot. And we actually have no idea what's going on here. So obviously, the take-home message is that we have no idea what's going on here. But it's damn interesting. Finally, I also want to say a little bit that we want to use this kind of profiling for clinical trials. A guy in our lab, in our group, he's absolutely crazy. And he's brilliant, I should say. So since this is recorded, isn't it? So what he did is that he looked at people with a fat liver, it's called NAFLD, and he did this systems biology modeling of what's going on in a liver that is actually starting to increased levels of fat, which of course then it's very common and also can lead to very serious cirrhosis and actually death. So what in the model, what they predicted was that they could add natural compounds to these people in rather high levels, and then it should start burning fat very selectively. So what we did then is that, of course, you have to do this first on animals and then in monkeys, and then you move into people. So 10 people, actually 9 people, were locked into a hotel room for a week, and they have to starve during the day, and then they could eat in the dinner, but they were not allowed to leave the hotel. And then they were fed with this rather common, this is the amino acid, this is some nucleotides and so on, so natural compounds that you can actually get in a health store. And the prediction was that the liver fat should be burned. So we are still in this clinical trial, but this is now the first results we are getting using this kind of omics technologies. And this is a heat map, and I'm not going to go into that, but there's a lot of proteins that seems to change. And this is actually during the first day of these people getting and as was just explained, you also have to have a control group. So you have 10 people in the control group and 9 in the group that got the cocktail. It is interesting that this is the control group here during one day. You can see 8 hours. And then you can see this protein is rapidly decreasing 2 or 3 hours. And when you then look at this protein, then you can see that this is famous because it functions as a major metabolic regulator, stimulates uptake of glucose in adipose tissue, and it actually confirms what the systems biology modeling has shown us. So with these results, actually, we have now moved into phase 2 clinical trials that hopefully then be finished before Christmas. So what I hope that I've shown you from our own kind of experience then is that we have some wonderful new tools for comprehensive and quantitative protein profiling of blood. I really think that this might change the way that we're looking at wellness and also maybe to follow people during clinical trials. What I found astonishing is that everybody in this room has his own protein profile, and it's unique, but it's also stable, at least during 2 years, if you don't have dramatic changes in lifestyle. I don't have time to talk about this, but one guy actually lost 17 kilos between 2 visits, and we just see a cascade of things happening. There's also another person that got a knee infection in Thailand, came home, and we just got this person just when he was coming home. And it was just a cascade of things happening. So this is, but maybe the most interesting for the pharma industry and for the physicians is that there are dramatic changes during drug treatment, and they're different in different people, and maybe that can tell us something about it. It has sort of been mentioning, we are very proud that we can lead an effort from Sweden to actually do the sort of a periodic table of human building blocks. But we are not alone. And I usually just mention these guys because they have a lot of funding. Only this Human Cell Atlas, we have a guy that you might know, Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook. He gave $3 billion of philanthropy to actually start this effort. But you also have Paul Allen from Microsoft in Seattle. You have Google, who's doing this baseline verily. And you also have IBM, which is trying to go beyond chess and beyond Go, and actually try to have IBM Watson to actually predict your health. It is interesting to see that a lot of these efforts are done by the IT guys, and this is not so surprising since it's very much data driven, and of course this is why they are working on it. Just want to say we have a fantastic group working on this, and I'm also very grateful to a lot of philanthropy, and we should be very grateful as researchers in Sweden that we have so much philanthropy that are putting money into these kind of big projects. And then I just finally want to say this is where we are at the Karolinska campus. And then I'm going to show you the movie again. And I know that Eugen and Stefan knows in what tissue we are. But can someone say what is the green stuff? What proteins are we staining that hasn't heard it before? Björn. Doesn't it look... I mean, we are actually now in a person in Stockholm. No, actually, this is mouse. Sorry. Sorry. No, it is a mouse, sorry. But anyone? No, this is not brain. So I said the red is actually nerves, but it is not, it is a peripheral organ. No? No? Oh, it's so good. So many guesses. If I say that this is probably some of you in this room maybe not has a problem where you lack this protein. What and this is a protein that this is a type of islands that actually gets degraded in the teenage years. Pancreas, very good. So this is actually insulin that is stained. And I just think that these new ways of going into the tissues in this 3D movie way is just wonderful. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Matthias. I love these graphic pictures and slides that you are able to show that have been developed by your group, not the least where you can see the movement of individuals, the profile of the individuals throughout their lifetime or over a certain time. And it speaks a little bit to the theme that we started this conference on, where we were discussing that maybe health monitoring is good to set a baseline and then you follow a trend and so. I know that you have one of the projects on which your group has worked is in the field of cancer, where you have been looking at basically all the biomarkers that the world has created so far, and you've been able to link it to outcome data. Could you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, maybe yes. So what we did in this case, which is also kind of an interesting way of doing science, is that a couple of years ago we downloaded a lot of publicly available data from something called the Cancer Genome Atlas, which is in America. It was a few petabytes of data. And then we actually reanalyzed it. And we were very lucky because the supercomputer center in Uppsala is almost empty during Christmas. So we had 6 weeks just by ourselves at the supercomputer center. And it was run a day and night for 6 weeks. And then we got for those of you, when you're doing science then, you do these couple of, when you do clinical studies, you do these couple of Maya plots. We produced more than 100 million couple of Maya plots. And then you can sort them with statistics, which some people say you shouldn't do. And then we can then show what proteins, when they are elevated, then has an indicator of the survival of the patients. What was interesting, and then we published it in Science, and it's the only time, since I'm an experimental scientist, it's the only time when we didn't do a single experiment, and yet we can publish an article in Science, although we did a lot of computing. What it showed, though, was that you can get very beautiful Kaplan-Meier plots, but when you actually looked at the data and we showed another way called survival scatter plots, it actually shows quite illustrative that what is very clear from a population point of view, it is not really that clear for an individual. So it is a little bit the same story as I was telling here, is that you have to then start working on the individual and try to find biomarkers that works on an individual, not on a population. And this is maybe one of the reasons why we have about 50,000 publications every year with a biomarker in the abstract, but only maybe 1 or 2 clinical products coming out of the market. So we have a very hard time to go from the Kaplan-Meier plots to something which is useful for the patient and therefore also for the physician. That's a very long answer, but yeah. Thank you.
I think this was a very interesting project because many of us have been working with epidemiological studies, looking at cohorts of people over a long time. Before you came, I mentioned a study that I was involved in many years ago where we studied 800,000 people, 36 million analysis, and we linked it to a lot of outcome studies. And there were a lot of correlations, associations with disease, but in retrospect, it has been very difficult to show that this has actually saved lives. It speaks a little bit to some skepticism around modern medicine, and are we doing any good here? Are we finding anything that actually is solving stuff? And maybe we don't need to debate that issue at this time. I would like to invite all the speakers up to the podium now, and we will take questions, and I will start off. Come on up, please. And so I think we will start with the question that came from the audience earlier. How do you know that things are bad for us? When should we decide, yes, this is bad for us? Maybe Emma, you can take up that thread.
No, but I think it was a very interesting question because when we talk about this evidence and scientific evidence, sometimes we have a lot on our feet, but other times we can't really say anything because we're not doing enough research. I myself wrote this column about whether dental floss was a fraud because somebody has been talking about it. It's a bluff, it's a fraud. We shouldn't be using it, but this was basically based on authorities in the US no longer recommending dental floss because it wasn't evidence-based because they hadn't basically done any research on it. So then we don't really know whether this is good for your health or not. So I think it's good to have these kind of recommendations that are evidence-based, but still it's very important also to communicate what does this actually mean that something is evidence-based or not.
In 2013, I think it was, Prasad and his co-workers looked at 2,000 studies that had been published, and over 300 of these studies were actually studies that were looking at interventions, actually doing something for the patients. And 40% of these studies actually resulted in a medical reversal, basically saying that whatever we did before was not good and we should do the opposite. And about 40% of the studies confirmed previous results, and the rest probably, well, I don't know exactly what happened there. So scientists are actually questioning not only alternative medicine, but they are actually questioning modern science also, exposing it to clinical trials to see whether the old truths really hold up or don't hold up. And I don't think that what you, Professor Ernst, have been doing in your professional life is therefore very controversial, because this is something that has to be done both with what we call well-established medical methods and with methods that are very old but have not been really tested in controlled clinical trials.
Yeah, I think that...
Maybe you should move the microphone a little bit closer.
And I think that's absolutely true. The scientific truth is never absolute. It's dynamic. It's changing all the time, and we are, as scientists, have to question it all the time in order to advance it. What is the difference between scam and real medicine is that in real medicine we take the consequences of these advances and we change our practice, whereas that doesn't happen in scam. To put it differently, Samuel Hahnemann was born 200 years ago. If he went into a exam of homeopathy, he would pass. If the best surgeon or internist of his time would try to pass in medical school, he would fail miserably.
Yeah. So one last thing I want to take up is the issue of placebo. We know that placebo works in certain patients and in certain situations, but we've come to a point where new therapies are not placebo controlled. They are often controlled against the best practice therapy that is available. How do you look at and how should we use placebo in the healthcare system? Is it ethical to use placebo at all? Is it do we trick? Do we lie to the patients when we are using placebo, or is it a useful instrument?
Well, lying is quite simply unethical. So even in clinical trials, we don't lie to patients. Patients get informed that and agree to being in a clinical trial and know that they have a 50% chance of getting a placebo. Is it always ethical to have placebo-controlled trials? No, and this is precisely why we have clinical trials of a new drug against an established drug, because you cannot very well treat cancer patients who would otherwise be dead in a year with a placebo. So it really does depend on your research question. If you want to, 50 years ago, if we had wanted to find out whether smoking causes lung cancer and had done this via a clinical trial, we would have had to recruit about 1,000 patients and force them to smoke. Is that ethical? Clearly not. So it really depends. But in medicine, we use placebo all the time, outside clinical trials. We use it in every single clinical practice. That is what we used to call in English good bedside manners. We are kind to our patients, we are empathetic, compassionate, and therefore we convey a placebo effect with effective treatments. By effective, I mean effective beyond the placebo effect. And that kills the argument that simply because homeopathy or any similar treatment is conveying a placebo effect and therefore it is good, that is nonsense, because a placebo effect doesn't require a placebo. And people who use only placebos in their clinical practice are quacks.
I think
just a comment. I mean, I completely agree, and that double-blind doesn't mean that you have to use placebo, of course, and especially in the field of cancer, always the control is the standard treatment, and then you add another treatment and you compare, and that's the whole point of a controlled study. So so I don't think that is a problem. It would be very, as you say, very unethical to go back and have something which is actually not the standard practice. Just a little bit on this difficult question on coming back to that on the how do we know if it's bad? And I think if you talk about treatments, I think, double-blind, the sort of standard way is the way to go. But obviously sometimes you don't know if apples is good or something. It's very hard to make studies about that. And one should remember that even one of the most toxic molecules for human beings is oxygen. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that we should avoid oxygen. Yeah, it's sometimes you have to sort of live with it, but obviously you should try to then avoid as much as possible the toxic things.
I think it would be very interesting if you could devise an experiment using your massive analysis capacity to test placebo in an ethical way. I mean, not in a disease state, but to give a drug compound or something that we know gives effect, and see if you can create a placebo effect also in the protein profile that you have.
And there are actually studies showing that you can get the placebo effect even if you know that you are receiving placebo. So then you don't have to have this ethical problem in your study. And I think it's also very interesting, these researchers that are actually looking at the placebo effect, how do you optimize it in a clinical setting? So I think it's a very interesting area.
So I would like to open up for questions from the public now. Who dares?
Yes.
Yep, go ahead.
A question to Matthias. First, it was very nice that you showed that the protein profile is individual in the sense that changes are individual. You cannot draw conclusion from that on a group. Yeah. The second thing was very also interesting that when you have a sudden change, a disruptive event, then you get a massive reaction on a lot of number of proteins. So my question is now, given these two facts, how you can define wellness on one hand, and how you are going to how you hope that one day you are going to be able to treat an individual patient with an individual symptom.
Well, that's the holy grail, isn't it? But I do think, and the answer I don't know. But what I'm a big believer in trying to have a sort of a science-based treatment, and what I'm hoping for is that we will find biomarkers that will tell us that this patient should be treated this way and so on. But I have to also say that we have terribly failed in the last 50 years as a community. But we haven't had these tools. The sort of figures that I showed now, where you're actually doing quantitative profiling, 1 microliter of blood, analyzing thousands of proteins, it's actually something extraordinary and rather new. But I don't know if we're going to go to it. Yeah.
Maybe a comment on that. Because we have in the system, human system, you have multiple control loops which control the same thing in different ways. So that's why it's making things complex. But this kind of problems you can handle. Deep learning is one of the ways. So going at 6 weeks is not enough on a computer for that. But did you try to do that? That is trying to isolate the impact of each of the loops or control loops. For example, the liver, you have this example, which is relatively simple.
Yes. Yeah.
Because it's diabetes type 2, so it's not that difficult. But that one, or even cardiovascular, which is much more complex.
Yeah. So the data I show today is basically very new. We have 250 systems biologists, bioinformatics, big data guys at SciLife Lab. So we're going to throw them, and we also have in this room one of the best in the world, actually. So obviously this is what we're going to try to do. I'm not a very big fan of artificial intelligence. I believe in human-based intelligence and letting the computer work for you, not artificially. But I still believe very much that. But one of the problems with this kind of work in the past is that the biological data is very noisy. We have analytical methods that are actually, even in the hospital diagnostic labs, they're actually quite noisy, and we need to get the technical variability down, the CVs down, and this is what we're trying to achieve now, and hopefully that will lead to a better world.
So at the end of the day, also we as humans are extremely different. Next to the cockroaches, I think we are the only multicellular organism that is able to survive in extremely variable environments, from the Arctic to Africa to high altitudes and so on. And we've done that through evolution by slowly migrating to different areas and also maybe picking up genes from our hominid cousins and so on. I'm not very surprised that it's difficult to find the golden nuggets that will create eventually a better healthcare. If there are no other questions, yes, there's a question there. Use the mic, please.
Use mic.
Yeah, you said that people that in social media, they are like influencer and they recommend something, and there are a lot of people that are following them and listen to them. Is there any law, against them if they recommend something and people taking that medicine or that supplement getting sick? Is there any law for that, or is it, something against that?
I'm not sure. I don't think what Danny did was criminal, at least. I know there was a lot of harsh reactions on what he said, so he finally removed this picture. But I don't think what he did was punishable.
Not only, not only him, but there are other people, other nationalities that they're influencer, they don't have any clue about medicine. They are like TV presenter or something, and they just say something and get money for that.
Yeah.
Is there any law in any countries against that, or is it only just?
I'm not sure, actually.
Can I?
Yeah.
There are a few restrictions which vary from country to country. In the UK, we have a cancer law that prohibits anybody to claim they can cure cancer. Yeah. So you can go and sue or try to sue everybody who makes such claims on social media, on Twitter, for instance. But if you try that, you will soon discover that you're totally impotent. You cannot do it because these claims are being done done a million times. You can hardly find who's making them, etc., etc. So, in practical terms, even though some restrictions may exist, it is anything goes. So it is a lawless space.
In Sweden, we did. There was this new KAM-utredningen that they did recently, but this is aimed towards the one who are providing these like alternative health options, and I don't think that involves these kind of influencers.
Go ahead,
Lena. I also have a question along these lines, and it's more from your own experience and turning to Emma, Frans, and to you, Professor Ernst. If you have sort of your own indications of, have you found some method in your communication to get through this wave of false news and all these both lies, intentional or not? Just from your own experience.
Well, as I said, I think it's very important to try to be preventive, because when people start believing in some weird idea, it can be very difficult to get them to change their mind. I sometimes meet people who don't want to vaccinate their children, and I think in that kind of situation it's quite important not to become too angry, or because then people will become very defensive. It's not only a threat towards what you believe, but also towards someone as a person. So I think it's important not to be too aggressive, and maybe try to connect with that person, that I understand that you're trying to do what's best for your child, and you are worried about the potential risks of getting vaccination, and to understand that. But if you look at the and try to explain, if you look at the research, it's very clear, and there's a lot of people, the billions of children have been vaccinated, and it's been a lot of research within this area. So try to also explain why we know that vaccines are safe and beneficial for the children's health. But it is actually very, very difficult. And it's important, as I say, to try to prevent these falsehoods from being spread.
One tool that we haven't mentioned at all is humor, and it's actually very effective. In certain instances, it might be the most effective. There are wonderful stand-up comedians in the UK who have taken down homeopathy, and it is not least thanks to them that the National Health Service doesn't support it anymore. It's not refunded anymore. And to people who don't vaccinate their kids, you might say, you don't need to vaccinate all your kids, just vaccinate the ones you want to keep.
One issue that has been discussed sometimes is compassionate use. If we can't do anything with modern medicine or traditional medicine, why not let them do that? And I know that Kjell Strandberg, who was the head of the medical products agency in Sweden for many years, you were involved with one such instance with the THX, if I remember correctly. Do you want to comment something?
Yes, it was a great problem if you enjoy great problems. Definitely, we had this thymus preparation from calves being produced in southern Sweden. And as an authority, of course, we rejected the idea that that would be a licensed product. But really, the National Board of Health and Welfare took a vote on this, and one guy happened to go to the loo, so there was a number of 13 people who voted on it, and the outcome was 7-6 to have it. Whether it was, you had to actually seek a granting by the National Board of Health and Welfare. As
you have to press them.
As the Medical Products Agency, we rejected the idea and put it over to the government as such. And it was very interesting that people were coming from all around the world to this little place in the county of Småland in Sweden. When we as an authority, since we didn't accept it, we were still kind enough to go down there in order to look at how it was actually manufactured, so it could be safe. And when the guy died, the business went down. So it was really the kind of charisma this guy had that made people believe that this could cure cancer. So it was a sad story in many, many ways. The disappointment of the patients that they couldn't get access to it, the disappointment of the National Board of Health and Welfare that they actually said that this could be used, whereas the Medical Products Agency, we said it's up to the government if this is going to stay. So it was a great problem at the time, and as a representative for the decision that it shouldn't be used, I received a number of threats. People really wanted to kill me, and I mean it was a relief, sorry to say, that this guy in Arneby died.
Thank you for those final words. Are there any other questions? Yes?
I just wanted to add a word on this THX. My father died from stomach cancer. And of course, first time they could cut away half of it, but second time the message to him was, I was present, so of course this was a tough blow to both him and me. But then, finally, after a few weeks, he got his little hope. So he went down to Småland and got some of the drinks. And it did not make him harm. It did not cure him. But I can say it was certainly nothing that we should worry too much about. It was one of those things you may need in a very orderly society that you can keep your trust to.
Other comments or questions? This is clearly a theme that is very interesting to a very broad population, so I'm sure that we will have reasons to come back and discuss this further. And with that, I think I can give the word to Stefan.
And I will be very short, but I'm totally overwhelmed and happy about the speakers and Eugen's work. I hope that you share that with me. And this is a small present. It is absolutely proven to be
chocolate.
Good for you. I start with Emma.
Best medicine ever.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. It's not.
Thank you.
Oh,
and I think we should give a great hand for all the speakers, Eugen, but also Maja, who did not only help us with the Kiruna squat, but also has actually helped us with all the organization. So thank you all.
I forgot about the Kiruna squats between the speakers. Sorry about that.
No, I think you were lazy. So this was a seminar that gave us a great food for thoughts, but now we need also some real food and some drinks. And I have a note, there will also be music, piano music from Jane Levkovskaya. Okay, thank you all.